Michael Cole had never thought his life would take this turn. At 42, after nearly 2 decades working as an executive chef in some of the finest restaurants along the East Coast, he had believed that his path was firmly set in the world of haute cuisine. But the world had shifted beneath his feet, like it had for so many others, when the pandemic shuttered his last venture, a high-end coastal bistro that had once drawn weekend crowds and rave reviews. The lockdowns were merciless, and by the time restrictions lifted, the business was too far gone to save. Michael found himself at a crossroads, too old to start from scratch in the cutthroat world of fine dining, but too proud to settle for a quiet fade into obscurity. It was during one of those long, sleepless nights that the idea had first taken root. If people could no longer come to him, why not bring the food to them? He poured his savings into outfitting a state-of-the-art food truck, not a kitschy street corner affair hawking greasy tacos or carnival food, but a fully equipped mobile kitchen designed to meet the highest standards of quality and sanitation. When a chance connection led him to a government procurement officer with FEMA, Michael recognized an opportunity that was both meaningful and practical. The agency was building out rapid response partnerships with mobile food vendors to provide hot meals to field teams and emergency responders during disaster operations. It was exactly the kind of work that spoke to Michael's sensibilities. A chance to serve, to stay mobile, to keep control over his work, and above all, to stay afloat financially in an uncertain economy. By midsummer, his rig was on the road. Officially contracted, fully certified, and carrying the necessary clearances, Michael's truck, Cole's Command Kitchen, became a familiar sight at staging areas and temporary FEMA bases across the state. When unprecedented storms battered the region that fall, flooding entire towns and displacing thousands, FEMA's need for reliable food vendors surged overnight. Michael rose to the occasion, often working 16-hour days to meet the demand, supplying hot, nutrient-dense meals not only to FEMA teams but to National Guard units and utility crews as well. The work was grueling, but for the first time in years, Michael felt alive with purpose again. His home base was a gated residential community just outside the capital, one of those carefully curated suburban enclaves designed to appeal to mid-level professionals and affluent retirees. When he had first rented the modest townhome 2 years ago, the location had seemed ideal, quiet, secure, and with ample off-street parking, including a private, deeded space that came with his lease. That parking spot had proven invaluable. When not deployed, Michael parked the food truck there overnight where it could be reloaded and sanitized between assignments. The arrangement had worked smoothly for months. He was discreet, kept to himself, and never operated the truck on the premises. Most of the neighbors hardly noticed the vehicle, and those who did typically expressed curiosity or even admiration when they happened to see it. But in every community, there is always one. Karen Hudson, the president of the Neighborhood Association Board, was a woman of tireless energy and boundless conviction. Widowed 5 years prior, she had channeled her considerable organizational talents into becoming the de facto guardian of the community's standards. Under her leadership, the association had embarked on an aggressive campaign of aesthetic improvements, stricter landscaping codes, tighter restrictions on exterior decorations, and an ongoing push to limit what types of vehicles could be seen within the gates. Michael had crossed paths with her only a few times, and those encounters had been cordial, if clipped. She knew who he was, and she knew about the food truck, but until recently there had been no formal objection, no complaint lodged against him. That changed during the most recent association meeting. Michael hadn't attended. It had fallen on a night when he was working a double shift at a FEMA staging center following a fresh round of storm damage. But word traveled fast in such circles. According to a neighbor who was present, the topic of commercial vehicles and neighborhood image had come up toward the end of the meeting, and Karen had seized upon it with characteristic zeal. Without naming Michael directly, she had railed against the unsightly industrial equipment, now visible in certain driveways, decrying it as a threat to property values and community reputation. She reportedly vowed to restore the neighborhood's visual harmony and hinted at new policy changes forthcoming. No official notice followed, and Michael, focused on the mounting demands of his contract work, largely put the gossip out of his mind. He might have continued to do so had it not been for what happened just days later. Returning from a grueling overnight deployment, Michael pulled through the community's gates shortly after dawn, eager for a few precious hours of rest. But when he rounded the corner to his designated parking spot, he found it empty. His food truck, his livelihood, was gone. At first, he thought perhaps there had been some mistake, or an unauthorized tow due to a misreading of the lease. But no notice had been posted on his door, no warning affixed to the parking area. His heart hammering, Michael placed a flurry of calls to the property management company, to the association office, to local towing companies. It took nearly 2 hours of relentless dialing before he got the answer he dreaded. The truck had been removed at the direction of the association board. A private tow operator, hired by the board's legal counsel, had executed the removal late the previous evening under what the office described as a standing directive to eliminate non-compliant vehicles. Payment for the tow and impound had been arranged in advance by an entity associated with the board, not the association itself, but an affiliated property services LLC controlled by Karen Hudson's close associates. When Michael asked on what grounds the removal had been authorized, the office cited recently clarified parking regulations that ostensibly prohibited commercial vehicles from overnight storage, though no such amendment had ever been communicated to residents in writing. Worse, the truck had been taken to a privately operated impound yard on the outskirts of the county, not the usual municipal lot, but a facility with opaque policies and exorbitant storage fees. When Michael finally reached the yard, the manager informed him that release of the vehicle would require not only payment of substantial impound fees, but also authorization from the contracting party, in this case the association board or its designated agent. Without that authorization, the truck would not be released, regardless of ownership or contractual necessity. Michael's pulse spiked. This wasn't just a neighborly spat or a procedural oversight. His truck was an active, federally contracted asset, supplying critical infrastructure to emergency response teams in the field. Under FEMA guidelines, any interference with contracted supply chains, particularly during active deployments, was a matter of federal concern. Failure to deliver on his current obligations could result not only in severe financial penalties, but also in permanent disqualification from future contracts. Time was already slipping away. Meals were scheduled for delivery that afternoon, and no replacement vendor could be mobilized in time. Exhausted, but now fully galvanized, Michael did what any professional would do in such a crisis. He escalated. First to FEMA's regional contracting officer, then to their legal department. Within hours, the agency had initiated formal inquiries and was preparing to file an emergency injunction to secure the release of the vehicle. Simultaneously, Michael retained his own legal counsel, a seasoned commercial attorney recommended by one of FEMA's compliance officers. This was no longer a matter to be handled through neighborhood channels. The implications had already outgrown the confines of the community, and through it all, one question burned in Michael's mind. Had Karen Hudson acted out of ignorance, failing to grasp the true nature of the vehicle's role? Or had she known exactly what she was doing when she set this chain of events in motion? One thing was certain. What had begun as a petty campaign for aesthetic conformity had just spiraled into a high-stakes legal and operational debacle, one with consequences that neither Karen nor her allies were remotely prepared to face. Michael spent the better part of that morning locked in a grim blur of phone calls and document exchanges, moving with the quiet, purposeful determination that had once made him a standout chef and now served him equally well in this new role. Crisis demanded clarity, not panic. He knew that time was his greatest enemy. With every passing hour, the situation edged closer to jeopardizing not just the immediate delivery schedule, but the entire relationship he had built with FEMA over the past year. The agency had little tolerance for disruptions, no matter how unjust the cause. Contract vendors were expected to deliver. Full stop. Excuses were not accepted, only results. And right now, he was dangerously close to failing them. By mid-morning, FEMA's legal team had formally notified Michael's counsel that they would move to intervene on his behalf if necessary, citing interference with federal supply chains as the operative issue. But even with their weight behind him, procedural delays loomed. The tow operator's yard operated on its own timetable, and the contracting agent, the association board's legal representative, had yet to respond to any of the official inquiries. Meanwhile, Michael's own calls to Karen Hudson and the board office continued to go unanswered. It was clear they were circling the wagons, either out of ignorance, arrogance, or both. Michael was no stranger to bureaucratic foot-dragging, but this was different. This was deliberate obstruction, thinly veiled behind the polite veneer of community standards. As the clock ticked toward noon, he made the first of what would become many difficult decisions that day. Rather than waiting passively for the impound release process to grind forward, he began mobilizing backup measures. Through FEMA's Contractor Liaison Office, he secured temporary meal support from a partner vendor located 2 counties over. Not ideal, as it would delay service by several hours, but enough to stave off immediate contract penalties. He also arranged for an emergency inspection team to assess his truck as soon as it was released, knowing full well that prolonged storage in an unregulated yard could result in sanitation or equipment violations. By early afternoon, with still no movement from the board, Michael drove to the yard in person. The facility sat at the ragged edge of the industrial district, a grim sprawl of chain-link fences and cracked asphalt. A solitary office trailer served as the administrative hub. The yard manager, a stocky man with a faded ball cap and a permanent scowl, regarded Michael with the practiced indifference of someone well accustomed to irate vehicle owners. When Michael presented his ownership documents and FEMA credentials, the man merely shrugged. "Doesn't matter who you are or what that truck does," he said flatly. "We got our instructions from the board's attorney. No release without their sign-off. You want it out, tell them to authorize it." Michael pressed the point, calmly but firmly. He explained the truck's role, the federal contract, the legal exposure they were inviting. The manager remained unmoved. "Not my problem," he said with a finality that brooked no further argument. "I just run the yard." It was a wall Michael had encountered before, in kitchens, in business, and now here. He knew better than to waste breath where leverage was absent. Instead, he returned to his car, dialed his attorney, and authorized the next step, filing for an emergency writ of possession, backed by FEMA's legal filing. It would take at least another day, perhaps 2, for the court to act. And that was assuming the board's legal counsel didn't attempt to stall further. Back at home, exhaustion clawed at him, but there was no time to yield to it. He began compiling a comprehensive dossier. Lease agreements, association correspondence, FEMA contracts, and documentation of the truck's parking arrangements. His goal was simple: to create an airtight record that would leave no room for the board to claim ignorance or procedural cover. He also reached out to the property management company that oversaw day-to-day operations of the community. The regional manager, a woman named Diane, who had always been cordial with Michael, sounded visibly uncomfortable when he described the situation. "Michael, I wasn't aware of any new parking directives," she admitted. "Nothing's been formally circulated to our office. If the board acted on this independently, well, that could be a serious overreach." It was confirmation of what Michael had already suspected. Karen Hudson, emboldened by her position and perhaps a misguided sense of authority, had bypassed proper channels entirely. Worse, she had done so without considering, or perhaps without caring, about the legal and operational consequences. It was a reckless move, and one that now threatened to cascade far beyond her intended scope. Late that evening, Michael finally received his first direct communication from the board. It arrived via email, unsigned, terse, and heavy with legal posturing. The message cited ongoing concerns regarding visual standards and commercial activity, claimed that recent clarifications to association guidelines prohibited overnight parking of industrial-grade vehicles, and asserted that the removal of his truck had been executed in accordance with board policy. No supporting documents were attached, no citation of amended regulations, just a vague reference to community expectations and an offer to discuss resolution avenues once impound fees had been satisfied. Michael read the message twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. It was a bluff, a thinly veiled attempt to retroactively justify an action that had no legal basis. There had been no public vote, no amendment to the community guidelines, no official notification process. They were improvising, scrambling to cover their tracks, and in doing so, they had crossed a line from mere procedural incompetence into actionable misconduct. He forwarded the email to his attorney and to FEMA's legal team. The response from the latter was swift and unequivocal. They would be filing a formal complaint with the county attorney's office the following morning, citing unlawful interference with federal operations. Moreover, FEMA would initiate its own internal review to assess potential contract impacts and determine next steps regarding the association's liability. Michael understood the stakes. If FEMA deemed the disruption severe enough, they could not only terminate his current contract, but also blacklist him from future opportunities, a devastating blow to both his business and his professional reputation. The thought churned in his gut as he paced the narrow confines of his living room, fatigue giving way to a cold, focused resolve. This was no longer just about retrieving a truck. It was about defending everything he had rebuilt in the wake of his restaurant's collapse. The food truck was more than a vehicle. It was his livelihood, his second chance, and he would not allow it to be sacrificed on the altar of one woman's misguided crusade for aesthetic purity. That night, as he prepared yet another round of legal documentation, Michael made a quiet vow. He would see this fight through to the end, not just for himself, but for every contractor, every small business owner who had ever been steamrolled by petty bureaucracy and unchecked arrogance. The battle lines had been drawn. Now it was time to press forward, methodically and without compromise. By dawn the next morning, Michael was already at his desk, dressed in the same clothes from the day before, fueled by black coffee and a sense of resolve that cut through his fatigue like a blade. Sleep had been brief and restless, broken by the constant chime of email notifications and the occasional late-night update from his attorney. The situation was evolving rapidly, and not in a direction he had anticipated. Overnight, FEMA's legal team had made good on their word, filing a formal complaint with the county attorney's office and submitting a petition for emergency injunctive relief in federal court. The county attorney's office, to its credit, had responded with surprising alacrity, contacting the association's legal counsel and advising them of the serious legal exposure now facing the board. Michael's attorney had also drafted a separate civil claim, laying out a potential damages case against both the association and the tow yard's operators. The opening salvo had been fired, and the other side was beginning to feel the heat. But the battle was far from over. If anything, it was entering a more dangerous phase. As Michael worked through a new round of documentation, his phone buzzed with a text from Diane, the regional property manager who had expressed quiet concern the day before. The message was short but telling. "You should know. Karen's meeting with outside counsel this morning. No communication from the board yet. Tread carefully." It confirmed what Michael had already suspected. Karen Hudson, far from backing down in the face of mounting legal pressure, was doubling down. He knew her type: proud, unyielding, unwilling to admit fault even when faced with overwhelming evidence. And now she had likely convinced herself that this was no longer about a truck or a contract, but a personal battle for control. Shortly after noon, Michael's attorney forwarded him a new communication from the board's legal counsel, this time more formal in tone. The letter acknowledged receipt of the federal filings and stated that the board disputes the characterization of its actions as unlawful, asserting that reasonable measures had been taken in accordance with community governance standards. No mention was made of the fact that no such standards had been formally adopted or communicated. More troubling, the letter included a veiled threat. In light of recent developments, the board reserves the right to initiate a review of your lease terms and parking privileges to ensure ongoing compliance with community expectations. It was a transparent attempt at intimidation, one Michael immediately recognized for what it was. The message was clear: back down or face the possibility of losing not just the parking space, but his residence entirely. Michael wasted no time crafting his response. Together with his attorney, they prepared a counter letter, methodically dismantling the board's assertions and reaffirming his legal standing. They also included a certified statement from FEMA's contracting office, attesting to the truck's official role in federal operations and warning of potential liability for continued obstruction. The letter was sent by courier, with copies to the county attorney's office and the federal court where the injunction hearing was now scheduled for the following day. The legal pressure was escalating, and Michael knew that the board would soon be forced to choose between capitulation or an all-out legal war. But the day's revelations were not over. Late in the afternoon, Diane called him directly, her voice low and tense. "Michael, there's something you need to know. This didn't come through official channels, but I heard it from one of our maintenance supervisors. Apparently, Karen's been working with a private property management firm, not our office, to draft new parking guidelines retroactively. They're trying to push them through as an emergency measure, claiming it's for community safety. The plan is to vote on it at an emergency board meeting tomorrow night." Michael's pulse quickened. It was a desperate gambit, an attempt to create legal cover after the fact. If the board managed to pass even a flimsy version of the new guidelines before the court hearing, they could muddy the waters and slow the legal process, perhaps even buy themselves enough time to negotiate a settlement on their own terms. He thanked Diane for the warning and immediately relayed the information to his attorney. Within an hour, they had filed an emergency motion to preclude any retroactive policy changes from influencing the pending injunction hearing. Meanwhile, the impound situation remained unresolved. Despite the county attorney's intervention, the tow yard's operator was refusing to release the truck without direct authorization from the board or its legal agent. The yard manager, perhaps sensing the legal noose tightening around his operation, had become increasingly evasive, refusing to answer Michael's calls and directing all inquiries to his own attorney. The truck remained locked behind high fences, its refrigeration systems powered down, its sanitation systems unmonitored. The longer it remained in that state, the greater the risk that it would be deemed non-compliant for federal service. A catastrophic outcome that could cripple Michael's business even if the truck were eventually recovered. Determined not to be outmaneuvered, Michael took further action. He arranged for an independent inspector, a retired state health official with impeccable credentials, to document the truck's condition at the impound site. Though access was limited, the inspector managed to capture enough photographic and video evidence to support a potential damages claim. Simultaneously, Michael engaged with FEMA's supply chain office to discuss contingency planning, ensuring that his role in ongoing relief operations would not be jeopardized by circumstances beyond his control. The agency was supportive but firm. While they recognized the extraordinary nature of the situation, their operational needs remained paramount. If the truck could not be cleared for service within 72 hours, they would have no choice but to reassign his contract to another vendor. The clock was ticking, and Michael felt every second of it in his bones. Yet, amidst the mounting legal and operational chaos, he maintained a cold, focused calm. This was a fight that would not be won through emotion or theatrics, but through methodical, relentless pressure. The board, and Karen Hudson in particular, had made a critical miscalculation in underestimating both the stakes and Michael's resolve. They had acted out of arrogance, assuming that a small business owner would lack the resources or connections to mount an effective defense. Now, faced with the combined weight of federal oversight and skilled legal representation, they were scrambling to regain control of a narrative that had already slipped from their grasp. As evening fell, Michael prepared for the battles ahead. The injunction hearing was set for 9 a.m. sharp the next morning. The emergency board meeting, should it proceed, would take place that night. Every move now mattered, every document, every conversation. The fight had entered a new phase. No longer a reactive defense, but a proactive campaign to hold those responsible to account. Michael knew that victory was far from certain. The legal system could be slow, the board could still find ways to obstruct or delay. But he also knew this: he had the truth on his side, and the law, however imperfect, was still a powerful ally when wielded with precision and discipline. And so, as he reviewed the final drafts of tomorrow's court filings, Michael allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had not asked for this fight, nor had he sought to become an unwilling symbol of small business resilience in the face of bureaucratic overreach. But now that the battle had been forced upon him, he would see it through, not just for himself but for the countless others who faced similar abuses without the means to resist. The first shots had been fired. The real war was just beginning. The courthouse was already humming with activity when Michael and his attorney arrived that morning. Federal cases always drew a particular gravity, and this was no exception. The courtroom was modest, but filled with the quiet tension of a proceeding where reputations and livelihoods hung in the balance. Michael sat straight back at the table beside his counsel, eyes steady, every movement deliberate. There was no room for uncertainty now. This was the moment where the facts would be laid bare. Across the aisle sat the association's counsel, a wiry man with a practiced expression of professional detachment. Karen Hudson was not present, a telling omission that Michael filed away with grim satisfaction. She had chosen to let her attorney carry the burden of her reckless decisions. The hearing began promptly, with the judge acknowledging the emergency nature of the filing. Michael's attorney presented the case with calm precision, laying out the timeline of events, the lack of formal notice, the absence of properly adopted guidelines, and, most damningly, the documented role of Michael's truck as an active federal asset. A sworn affidavit from FEMA's contracting officer underscored the gravity of the interference, emphasizing that the unauthorized removal of the truck had disrupted critical emergency supply operations. The evidence was clear and compelling. The association's counsel attempted a defense built on procedural ambiguity. He argued that the board had acted within its broad discretion to maintain community standards and suggested that Michael had been aware of ongoing concerns regarding the truck's presence. He further claimed that the board had been in the process of clarifying its guidelines and that the removal of the truck had been conducted in good faith to preserve the character of the neighborhood. But without supporting documentation or a clear record of board action, the argument rang hollow. The judge, a seasoned jurist with little patience for obfuscation, pressed the association's counsel sharply on these points, eliciting a series of strained responses that only served to highlight the weakness of their position. By the end of the hearing, the outcome was clear. The judge granted the emergency injunction, ordering the immediate release of Michael's truck and prohibiting any further interference with its lawful operation. Furthermore, the judge warned that any attempt to enforce retroactive guidelines or to retaliate against Michael would be subject to additional sanctions. The ruling was a decisive victory, but it was not the end of the battle. The association still faced potential civil liability, and the damage to the truck and to Michael's business would require careful documentation and pursuit. As Michael left the courthouse, a wave of relief washed over him, tempered by the knowledge that much work remained. He wasted no time. His attorney contacted the tow yard's counsel with a copy of the court order, securing the truck's release by early afternoon. Michael personally oversaw the recovery process, arriving at the yard with an independent inspector and a FEMA compliance officer in tow. What they found was both validating and infuriating. The truck's refrigeration systems had been powered down for over 36 hours, compromising perishable supplies. Several exterior access panels showed signs of forced entry, and key sanitation systems had been tampered with during an unsanctioned inspection conducted by the yard staff. The evidence was meticulously documented, forming the foundation for a comprehensive damages claim. Returning the truck to his secured service depot, Michael initiated an intensive inspection and sanitation process, working alongside FEMA's compliance team to ensure the vehicle could be certified for return to active duty. It was a grueling process, but by late evening, the truck was cleared, and Michael was able to resume meal production for the next operational cycle. The narrow escape from contract termination was a testament to his discipline and the unwavering support of his professional network. Yet even as he pushed through the recovery efforts, the broader conflict continued to unfold. That evening, as expected, the association convened its emergency board meeting. Though Michael was not obligated to attend, he monitored the proceedings through a reliable proxy, a sympathetic neighbor who had grown increasingly disillusioned with Karen's leadership. The meeting was contentious from the outset. Several board members openly questioned the legality and timing of the proposed parking guidelines, raising concerns about liability exposure and the integrity of the board's process. Tensions boiled over when it became clear that Karen had bypassed standard procedural requirements in her rush to codify the retroactive policy. Faced with mounting opposition and the weight of the court's injunction, the proposed guidelines were tabled indefinitely. The political fallout within the board was swift. Two members publicly distanced themselves from Karen's actions, citing a lack of transparency and due process. Rumblings of a potential leadership challenge began circulating among the membership, signaling a fracturing of Karen's once unassailable position. For Michael, the developments were a vindication of sorts, proof that his principled resistance was resonating beyond the confines of the courtroom. But he remained cautious. Karen was not one to retreat quietly. Her network within the community was deep, and her pride had been wounded. Michael anticipated further attempts at retaliation, whether through informal pressure, administrative maneuvering, or whisper campaigns designed to erode his standing among the residents. It was a fight that would demand continued vigilance and strategic discipline. In the days that followed, Michael focused on consolidating his position. He worked closely with his attorney to prepare a formal civil claim against the association and the tow yard, detailing the operational disruptions, the physical damages to the truck, and the reputational harm incurred. Simultaneously, he engaged with FEMA's Contractor Relations Office to document the incident and to reinforce his commitment to compliance and service excellence. The agency's response was encouraging. While the disruption had been serious, Michael's proactive handling of the crisis had preserved their confidence in his capabilities. The message was clear. His contract remained secure, and future opportunities would not be jeopardized. Through it all, Michael maintained his outward composure, projecting the steadiness and professionalism that had become his hallmark. But beneath the surface, the emotional toll was undeniable. The ordeal had tested every facet of his resilience, mental, physical, and financial. It had also underscored a sobering reality. Even in a society governed by laws and contracts, individual ambition and petty tyranny could wreak havoc on lives and livelihoods. It was a lesson Michael would not soon forget. As he stood once more beside his restored truck, supervising the final stages of recertification, Michael allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The fight was far from over. Legal battles still loomed, and community dynamics remained fraught. But in that moment, surrounded by the tangible fruits of his labor, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced down a campaign of arrogance and overreach, not with bluster or bombast, but with precision, integrity, and unyielding resolve. And in doing so, he had not only defended his livelihood, he had set a precedent that would echo beyond his own experience. The path ahead would demand continued vigilance, but Michael was ready. The war was not yet won, but the tide had begun to turn. The days that followed the injunction ruling should have brought some measure of calm, a chance for Michael to regroup and focus entirely on his work. In the immediate sense, he had won an important legal battle, recovered his truck, and preserved his contract with FEMA. The association's attempt to codify retroactive parking restrictions had failed, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to clear. But beneath the surface, the undercurrents of resentment and maneuvering remained strong. Michael had no illusions about Karen Hudson's capacity for retaliation, nor did he underestimate her resolve to regain control of the narrative within the community. He had learned long ago that pride wounded in public rarely heals in private, and this was a woman whose pride had been battered under the scrutiny of a federal courtroom. It began, subtly enough. Within a week of the court's ruling, Michael began receiving notices from the association citing minor violations of community standards. First, it was the placement of his trash receptacles, then a claim that his landscaping was out of compliance with neighborhood guidelines. Each notice was petty, thinly justified, and clearly designed to harass rather than to correct any genuine deficiency. Michael responded to each in a measured, professional manner, documenting his compliance and rebutting the claims where appropriate. His attorney advised that while individually insignificant, the pattern of harassment could be used to substantiate claims of retaliatory conduct in the ongoing civil case. But the campaign soon escalated beyond the realm of passive-aggressive paperwork. Anonymous complaints were filed with the local zoning office, alleging that Michael was conducting unauthorized commercial operations from his residence. Inspectors were dispatched, though upon arrival they found nothing amiss. Michael's lease, his FEMA contract, and the court's injunction all made clear that his parking arrangement was lawful and that no on-site business was being conducted. Still, the process consumed time and energy that Michael could ill afford. Each visit required coordination, documentation, and follow-up, distractions from the demanding schedule of meal production and delivery that remained his primary focus. More concerning were the whispers that began to circulate among the residents. A few neighbors, emboldened by the recent events, approached Michael with quiet words of support, expressing dismay at the board's actions. Others, however, grew cold or distant, clearly influenced by a steady undercurrent of rumor and innuendo. Karen's allies were actively working to paint Michael as a disruptive force, a troublemaker who had brought unnecessary legal scrutiny to the community. The narrative they crafted was insidious, that Michael's business presence was a liability, that his legal actions threatened property values, that his continued residence was incompatible with the character of the neighborhood. It was a calculated effort to isolate him socially, to erode the informal networks of support that often prove decisive in community disputes. Michael understood the tactic well. In kitchens, as in life, politics often mattered as much as skill. He responded with quiet dignity, maintaining his professional demeanor and focusing on the relationships that mattered most. Those with his clients, his legal team, and the few allies within the community who remained steadfast. But the most brazen move came in the form of a formal action by the board. Without prior notice, Michael received a registered letter informing him that the association would be initiating a review of his lease compliance, citing a newly discovered clause regarding exclusive residential use. The letter claimed that the presence of a commercial vehicle, regardless of contractual or legal status, constituted a potential breach of the lease's intent. It further warned that failure to resolve the issue could result in lease termination proceedings. The timing was no coincidence. The letter arrived on the eve of a major FEMA deployment, one that would see Michael's truck serving in a high-visibility capacity at a regional disaster response hub. The message was clear: back down or face the threat of eviction at the worst possible moment. It was a naked attempt to leverage his dependence on housing stability against him, to force a choice between professional obligations and personal security. Michael wasted no time in responding. His attorney drafted a comprehensive rebuttal, detailing the legal protections afforded by the court's injunction, the terms of the FEMA contract, and the binding nature of his lease agreement. The letter made clear that any attempt to pursue eviction under these pretenses would constitute a further act of retaliation, exposing the association to additional liability. Copies were sent not only to the board, but also to the county attorney's office and to FEMA's legal counsel, ensuring that the issue was documented across all relevant channels. At the same time, Michael took proactive steps to fortify his position. He engaged a respected real estate attorney to conduct a full review of his lease and the association's governing documents, identifying every potential avenue for legal counteraction. He also reached out to the property management company, securing written confirmation that no valid lease violations had been recorded. Importantly, he maintained open communication with FEMA, keeping them apprised of each development and reaffirming his commitment to uninterrupted service. Throughout this escalating conflict, Michael never lost sight of the practical realities of his work. His truck remained operational, his deliveries consistent, his compliance spotless. In the eyes of FEMA and his professional peers, he remained a model contractor, a fact that further insulated him from the board's attempts to undermine his standing. Yet the stress of constant vigilance took its toll. Sleep remained elusive. His focus stretched thin between legal battles and operational demands. It was a test of endurance, one that required not only professional acumen, but personal resilience. Then, in a moment that crystallized the nature of the battle, Michael received an unexpected call from a member of the board. One of the dissenting voices who had opposed Karen's actions reached out privately, offering insight into the board's internal dynamics. The member revealed that Karen, frustrated by her inability to control the legal narrative, had begun pressuring other board members to authorize further actions against Michael, up to and including formal eviction proceedings and additional fines. The member warned that while resistance remained strong within the board, Karen was leveraging every ounce of her political capital to push her agenda forward. The call confirmed what Michael had suspected. The conflict was now deeply personal for Karen. It was no longer about community standards or legal principles. It was about pride, control, and the refusal to concede defeat. But it also revealed a crucial opportunity. The board was divided, its cohesion fractured by the fallout of the injunction and the mounting legal risks. If Michael could continue to press his case with professionalism and restraint, he could further isolate Karen and shift the balance of power within the board. With this in mind, Michael and his legal team prepared the next phase of their strategy. They drafted a comprehensive complaint detailing the pattern of retaliatory conduct, the misuse of board authority, and the personal liability exposure facing individual board members. The complaint was shared in draft form with the board's counsel, accompanied by a clear offer. Cease all further retaliatory actions, issue a formal acknowledgement of the court's ruling, and engage in good faith discussions to resolve the remaining disputes. Failure to comply would trigger the filing of the complaint and the pursuit of individual liability claims. The gambit was bold but calculated. It placed the onus squarely on the board to choose between continued escalation and negotiated resolution. It also served to drive a wedge between Karen and the more cautious members of the board, many of whom had grown weary of the legal and reputational risks she had brought upon the community. As the complaint was delivered, Michael returned to his work with renewed focus. The meals still needed to be prepared, the deliveries made, the service upheld. In this, as in all things, he found his anchor. The legal battles would play out as they must, but the integrity of his work remained non-negotiable. And so, as the second wave of conflict surged around him, Michael stood resolute. He had faced greater challenges in the kitchens of his past, in the crucibles of leadership and endurance. This was but another test, one he would meet with the same unwavering discipline that had brought him this far. The delivery of the formal complaint to the board marked a decisive turning point in the conflict, though the days that followed unfolded with an unsettling tension that pressed against Michael's every waking hour. The board's counsel had acknowledged receipt of the complaint but offered no immediate response, a silence that was itself revealing. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure on the board was mounting. Conversations within the community grew more animated, whispers of the legal risks and reputational damage filtering through homeowner networks and private social groups. Even those previously indifferent to the conflict were beginning to take notice, questioning why a federal contractor who had been publicly vindicated in court was still being targeted by their own board. Karen Hudson, for her part, had grown increasingly isolated. The internal fractures within the board had deepened, with at least 2 members openly advocating for a negotiated settlement to avoid further exposure. Yet Karen remained defiant, convinced that yielding now would amount to an admission of guilt she could not politically afford. Her stubbornness, however, was wearing thin even among her most loyal allies. The board was no longer a unified front, but a battleground of competing interests, and Michael knew that time was now his strongest ally. Then came the inevitable escalation. Late on a Friday afternoon, as Michael was preparing the final stages of a weekend deployment for FEMA, his attorney forwarded a new communication from the board, a formal notice of intent to pursue lease termination proceedings. The letter was filled with legal posturing and vague references to community disruption and failure to uphold the spirit of the lease agreement. But it was clear in its purpose, a last-ditch attempt to force Michael from the community through sheer attrition. The timing was calculated. The notice arrived just as Michael was preparing for one of the largest FEMA operations of the season, a deployment that would see his truck operating at full capacity for several consecutive days. The board clearly hoped to overwhelm him with legal and logistical pressure at a moment of peak professional demand. But Michael was prepared. His legal team immediately filed an emergency motion to block the termination attempt, citing the ongoing federal injunction, the retaliatory nature of the board's actions, and the imminent operational requirements of his FEMA contract. Simultaneously, FEMA's legal counsel escalated their involvement, issuing a formal letter to the board and to the property management company. The letter left no room for ambiguity. Any action that interfered with Michael's ability to fulfill his federal contract would be treated as obstruction of federal operations, subject to referral for criminal investigation. The stakes had now risen beyond the realm of civil liability. The board was playing with fire, and Karen Hudson's reckless determination was placing the entire association in the crosshairs of federal scrutiny. As the weekend deployment commenced, Michael remained outwardly composed, executing his operational duties with the same precision and professionalism that had earned him FEMA's trust. But beneath the surface, the strain was immense. The constant legal maneuvering, the social isolation within his own community, the looming threat to his housing stability, all weighed heavily. Yet in that crucible of adversity, Michael found a renewed clarity of purpose. This was no longer just a personal battle. It was a fight for the integrity of his profession, for the principle that no individual or board could arbitrarily undermine the lawful operations of those serving the public good. Then came the breaking point. On the second day of the deployment, as Michael coordinated meal deliveries at the FEMA Operations Center, he received an urgent call from his attorney. A whistleblower from within the board had come forward, providing a cache of internal communications that revealed the full extent of Karen's machinations. The emails and meeting notes documented a deliberate strategy to target Michael for removal, driven not by any legitimate community concern, but by Karen's personal animus and political ambitions. The documents further revealed that the parking guideline initiative and the subsequent retaliatory actions had been orchestrated in secret, without proper board authorization or legal review. Armed with this explosive evidence, Michael's legal team moved swiftly. The materials were submitted to the court as part of a supplemental filing, bolstering the existing claims of retaliation and bad faith. The impact was immediate. The court scheduled an expedited hearing to address the new evidence, and the county attorney's office launched a parallel investigation into potential misconduct by the board. The ripple effects were felt throughout the community. News of the whistleblower's revelations spread quickly, eroding what little support Karen still commanded. The board's remaining members, now acutely aware of their own legal exposure, began distancing themselves from her, some even publicly calling for her resignation. The property management company, sensing the shifting tides, issued a formal statement affirming Michael's compliance with all lease terms and disavowing any involvement in the board's actions. As the hearing approached, the atmosphere within the community grew charged with anticipation. The board's counsel, faced with overwhelming evidence and a rapidly collapsing defense, sought to negotiate a settlement. But Michael, guided by his legal team and the principle of accountability, insisted that any resolution must include a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing and binding safeguards against future retaliation. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was filled to capacity, an unusual sight for a civil proceeding of this nature. Homeowners, legal observers, and even representatives from FEMA attended, a testament to the broader significance the case had acquired. Michael entered the courtroom with the same calm resolve that had carried him through the ordeal, flanked by his attorney and supported by the quiet nods of those who had come to witness the culmination of the battle. The proceedings were swift and decisive. Confronted with irrefutable evidence of misconduct, the board's counsel conceded key points, effectively dismantling their defense. The judge, in a stern rebuke, affirmed the injunction, barred any further retaliatory actions, and referred the matter to the appropriate authorities for further review. Karen Hudson, though not present, was formally named in the court's findings as the primary architect of the unlawful campaign. As the gavel fell, a wave of relief swept through Michael, tempered by the sober understanding that the fight, while largely won, had come at a great cost. Yet there was also a profound sense of vindication. The principles of fairness, professionalism, and lawful conduct had prevailed over arrogance and abuse of power. The message sent to the community, and to any who might consider similar overreach in the future, was clear and unambiguous. Outside the courthouse, Michael was approached by several FEMA officials who expressed their appreciation for his unwavering dedication under extraordinary pressure. Their words, simple and direct, carried a weight beyond any legal victory. For Michael, it was the ultimate validation, a reaffirmation that his work mattered, that his integrity had endured the crucible of conflict intact. As he returned to his operations, the road ahead still held challenges. The community dynamics remained fragile, the social fabric strained by the months of conflict. But Michael was no stranger to hard roads. In the kitchen, as in life, the path to excellence was rarely smooth. It was forged in fire, tempered by discipline, and sustained by an unyielding commitment to purpose. In the days that followed, as the community began to reckon with the aftermath, Michael resumed his work with renewed clarity. The battle had tested him in ways he could scarcely have imagined, but it had also affirmed the core values that had guided his life and career, and in that hard-earned victory he found not just resolution, but a deeper sense of purpose, one that would carry him forward no matter what storms might yet lie ahead. In the weeks following the court's final ruling, the atmosphere within the community shifted palpably. The open hostility that had colored so many of Michael's interactions began to ebb, replaced by a wary respect from some, quiet acknowledgement from others. The public disclosure of the board's internal communications had stripped away any pretense surrounding the motivations behind the campaign against him. It was no longer possible for even the staunchest defenders of Karen Hudson to argue that her actions had been in the community's best interest. What remained was an undeniable record of personal vendetta pursued at great cost to the association's integrity and legal standing. Karen's position on the board quickly became untenable. Under mounting pressure from both fellow board members and an increasingly vocal contingent of homeowners, she tendered her resignation in a brief and graceless statement, citing personal considerations, and an expressed desire to refocus on family and personal priorities. It was a hollow attempt to mask a forced retreat, but Michael felt no particular satisfaction in her fall. The real victory lay not in personal retribution, but in the restoration of principle and lawful governance within the community. The board, chastened and seeking to repair its fractured credibility, moved swiftly to implement a series of reforms. A comprehensive review of association governance policies was initiated, with new safeguards introduced to prevent unilateral actions of the kind that had precipitated the conflict. Clear guidelines for the treatment of contractors, federal or otherwise, were adopted, ensuring that no future board could again target residents engaged in lawful professional service. Importantly, an independent oversight committee was established to provide homeowners with a transparent channel for addressing grievances, free from the influence of any single board member. For Michael, the aftermath was a period of careful recalibration. Though the legal battles had been largely resolved in his favor, the personal toll remained. The strain of sustained conflict, the social isolation, and the relentless demands of maintaining operational excellence under pressure had left their mark. Yet, through it all, his professional standing with FEMA had only strengthened. The agency's leadership had commended his conduct throughout the ordeal, and his performance evaluations reflected not only the quality of his service, but the resilience he had demonstrated under extraordinary circumstances. In a gesture that underscored their continued confidence, FEMA offered Michael the opportunity to expand his role within their contractor network, including the option to serve as a peer mentor for new vendors entering the program. It was an offer he accepted with quiet pride, recognizing it as both an endorsement of his professionalism and a chance to help others navigate the complex and often unforgiving terrain of federal contracting. Back within the community, the social dynamics remained complex. Some neighbors who had once kept their distance now extended tentative gestures of reconciliation. Others remained aloof, unwilling or unable to reconcile their previous alignment with Karen's agenda. Michael accepted this reality without bitterness. Trust, once broken, could not be forced back into place. But neither did he dwell on the divisions. His focus remained forward-looking, centered on his work, his principles, and the commitments that had sustained him throughout the conflict. In a decision that reflected both pragmatism and a desire for long-term stability, Michael chose to renew his lease with the addition of explicit legal protections that enshrined the court's findings and precluded future harassment. The board, eager to avoid further litigation and mindful of their obligations, accepted the revised terms without contest. It was a quiet but meaningful affirmation of the ground Michael had gained. A space secured not through aggression, but through the disciplined exercise of legal and professional integrity. Life, inevitably, began to normalize. The rhythm of deployments and meal preparation resumed its familiar cadence. The truck, now fully restored and certified, continued to serve on the front lines of FEMA's relief efforts, its presence a visible testament to resilience and purpose. And for Michael, the experience, though hard-won, had crystallized a deeper understanding of the balance between professional duty and personal fortitude. In the months that followed, as new storms came and went, and as the demands of the work continued to evolve, Michael found that his resolve had only deepened. The conflict had tested him in ways he had never anticipated, but it had also affirmed the values that had guided him from the beginning: a commitment to service, to fairness, to doing what was right even when the path was hard. And in that affirmation, he found not only closure, but the quiet strength to face whatever challenges the road ahead might bring.